Hello, everyone. I'm Karen Tucker, and I am here today with author S.J. Sindu. Sindu is a Tamil diaspora author of 2 literary novels, 2 hybrid chapbooks, and 2 forthcoming graphic novels. Her first novel, Marriage of a Thousand Lies, won the Publishing Triangle Edmund White Award, and her second novel, Blueskin Gods, was published in November 2021. A 2013 Lambda Literary Fellow, Sindu holds a PhD in English and Creative Writing from Florida State University. Sindu currently teaches at the University of Toronto at Scarborough. Sindu's newest work, a hybrid chapbook titled Dominant Genes, was published by Black Lawrence Press in February 2022. Marriage of a Thousand Lies, the debut novel. Blueskin Gods, the current novel that we'll largely be talking about today, and Dominant Genes, the chapbook that was just released. Sindu is a dear friend. We were colleagues together at Florida State when we were PhD students together. I'm honored and thrilled to be in this conversation with Sindu, and I was lucky enough to read this novel, Blueskin Gods, in manuscript form in early drafts, and now to talk about the finished project is just incredible. So thank you, Sindu, for asking me to do this.
Oh my gosh, thank you so much for doing it. Oh.
Would you tell, I remember you telling me 5 years ago, maybe, how you first came to enter this story. Would you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I had just finished Marriage of a Thousand Lies, and I had sent it off, and I was like sort of floundering around because I didn't have another novel already in the works. And I moved to Florida, and I wanted to start my time at Florida by starting a new novel. And so I tried a couple of different things. It didn't work. But then there was a short story about a boy who grows wings, and I wrote it in Boston right before I moved. And it was about how people believed that this boy's wings, the feather from a wing, could heal them of anything, any ailment. And I really was fascinated with this idea of people believing in the healing power of others, this idea that you could take a living human being and sort of elevate them to godhood. And so I started thinking and researching about child gods, this idea that somehow there's a divine force that could be incarnated in a child. And while I was doing my research, I came across a couple of different news stories. One was about a young girl born in India who was born with multiple limbs, and people believed that she was the vessel for the goddess, and they didn't want their limbs to be removed. And then I watched this documentary called Kumare, where Vikram Gandhi, who is a filmmaker, documentary filmmaker, basically pretends to be a guru and like wears orange cotton, like sort of wraps it around himself, and he makes up yoga moves and like just like is winging it the whole time. He's just saying random things as wisdom, and he walks across and travels across the southwest of the US and amasses this giant following of people. And I found it so fascinating that people were following him. And I was like, what is it that makes people want to believe in him so much? And especially, and I'm going to ruin the documentary for you, after he comes out and tells them that he's a fraud, a lot of people still want to believe in him. And that sealed it for me. I was like, okay, that's it. This is my topic. I have to write about this. So that's how I started crafting the situation of the novel. And once I started doing that, the character of Kalki started to take shape for me.
I didn't even make the connection until you were just speaking, but it reminds me too of what we've seen in recent years in US politics, with people really wanting to believe in their chosen leader, despite evidence proving that they're a fraud. And there is something
Yeah,
about that.
I had no idea. Like, I didn't even begin to imagine that this novel would come out like during the Trump era. Like, that was not, like, it was not even in my purview, but oh my gosh, it changed the entire conversation to have this novel come out during that time.
Yeah. Okay, that makes me think of another question, then I'm going to hold that for a little bit later, because I don't want to jump ahead too much. I'm really interested in one thing that I noticed as I was, reading your novel this time. It struck me really clearly that you've chosen a narrator who is telling a story that he himself rarely understands, especially when he's younger, and even as he grows older and learns more and more. Still seems to know less about his own story than many of the people around him. And I think that's a really brilliant move. I'd love to hear how you came up with it. What was your thinking behind it?
Well, I wanted him to be a character that we could absolutely root for. So like my first novel, I had a character who was sort of, hard to like at times. I think some people really liked her and some people didn't, and some people were really frustrated with Lucky's choices. And the second novel, I wanted to have a character that you could absolutely root for. You were behind him the whole time. And that meant that, also with a child narrator, I was concerned about how to present a story that's nuanced and complex for adults with a child character. And so one way to do that is to have a retrospective narrator. So I have Kalki in the present time. He's an adult looking back on it. He's like in his mid-30s. He's looking back on his childhood. And so he's able to give us some of that contextualization, some of that perspective. But it was really important to me to show exactly how Kalki is being sort of manipulated, but not specifically by most people. It's just that they have such high expectations for him that he is caught between those expectations and just wanting to be a child. He wants to run around and play, and he wants to at the same time be a good child god and make his parents happy, especially his father, who has these like giant expectations for him. And it was really tricky figuring out how to show that in a balanced way, how to show the ways in which Kalki is basically caught in his own trap, and that it takes him 10 years or more than 10 years, 12 years to figure out how to extricate himself from this like net that he's caught in. But I think part of it was like very much line level stuff, line level concerns of like pacing, how to balance Kalki's interiority as a child with his insight as an adult, with the action of the actual scene, with the dialogue. And it was through dialogue and action and the child's interiority that I was really able to try to get at the bigger machinations of what's going around him. And that took a very long time to get at. It took 5 years to write this novel. And by write, I mean, I wrote it in a year and then 4 more years to revise, as you know. But yeah, that was kind of my thinking. And maybe I should read a little bit from the book.
I would love that. Yes.
And I'll read, this is one of the very, very early scenes. And it is basically the first time we see a healing session happen at the ashram. And this is his first test as a child god. He is supposed to heal this young girl named Rupa, who is basically sort of withering away. and she's been brought from a very far way to this ashram to be healed. Finally, the bhajan ended and the healing session began. All the villagers stood, lining up. I put the kids and their game out of my head and focused instead on the room here, now. The villagers would sit in front of me, tell me their problems, sometimes physical, sometimes emotional, sometimes financial, and I would heal them. I spun armfuls of cotton in my mind into fine, strong God light, blue inside my skin, and focused it outward. I chanted Om Shri Ram over and over in my head. This was my prayer to Rama, one of my previous incarnations. An older, hunched woman came forward, holding her lower back. She touched my feet. I blessed her. How did you hurt your back? I asked. Aya, my father, had taught me this. Diagnose early, before they can tell you. Too much work for an old woman. Your sons should take care of you better. My sons don't care. I prayed and hovered my hands over her. I willed my light to spin into the muscles of her back. Om Shri Ram. She stood up straighter, hands at her lower back. Her face relaxed as I pushed my energy into her. Thank you, she said. I kept an eye on Aya for his nod to show me I was doing the right thing. He nodded. Next, a young boy who was developing too slowly, a regular. Every time I prayed over him, he came back the next week stronger and taller. Om Shri Ram. A man whose textile selling business wasn't going well. He touched my feet, and I told him he would sell more puravais and veshtis next week. Om Shri Ram. A young woman nearing 30 and still not married. Her parents had set her up with an arranged marriage. The groom was scheduled to visit their house on Monday. I blessed her with luck. Om Shri Ram. One family, a young father with his wife and small child, came from many miles away. The child's legs and arms were whittled and thin. Her father carried her in his arms like she weighed nothing, though she was nearly my height, and he placed her on the floor in front of me. I shifted on my cushion to get a better look. This was it. This was my test. I was sure of it. Rupa's face was sunken in, like she hadn't eaten in weeks. Frail skin stretched over bone. She looked almost like a corpse, but her eyes were pretty and large, and she watched me as she lay on the bare cement floor, her chest moving up and down fast like a songbird's. She was almost beautiful if I looked only at her eyes. The God energy filled my skin, filled the inside of me shaped like a room, and I looked around and saw the others filled with their own energies, their own people energies, but Rupa's skin was empty. It was like her soul couldn't find any room inside her fragile body anymore. I didn't know if a person could leave a body and still be a person. And the body they left behind, was that body a person? But her eyes, I could still see her personness in her eyes. Please, her father said, our daughter needs healing. We can't afford to pay. He glanced at Aya, at the ground, and finally toward me. He held pain in his face and embarrassment. Aya had told me that a lot of men find it hard to ask for help. The father dropped his gaze to the floor. How did she get like this? I asked. I always knew to ask the question, though I still didn't know what to do with the answer. Aya knew, and he would tell me what to do. She took ill one day. She's not eating. The man looked at his wife, who covered her mouth with her hands. We have 4 sons. We can't afford to bring her to the private hospital. The doctors at the clinics don't know what to do. Aya nodded at me, a signal to begin my healing prayer. I sat myself next to the girl, the cold of the cement floor shocking my legs through my veshti. When I looked only at her pretty eyes, the rest of her receded. I took some kumkum powder and rubbed a line of it on her forehead. People normally got kumkumum, turmeric, sandalwood powders from their local market, but we also made them at the ashram. On any given day, my aunt and uncle, Vasandichiti and Kandachitapa, Lakshman's parents, would sit grinding sticks of sandalwood or dried turmeric roots on stone in order to make the powders we sold. The villagers bought them for the shrines in their houses, because what we made was purer, made with care, and made in the home of a god. I put my hands over Rupa's face and closed my eyes. Om Shri Ram. I tried to summon up the god energy inside me, sinewy and blue and gold. Om Shri Ram, blue and gold and bright. I touched her forehead with my thumb. She was dying, and I was the only one who could help. This was my first test. I tried to push the energy inside of her, gold and luminescent and blue. Om Shri Ram. She didn't move. She lay where her father had put her, eyes darting around the room. The room had stopped breathing, everyone watching us. My lungs felt too small. I pushed more God energy, spun more of the mind cotton into light, pushed it all inside her. But still she lay there, with everyone watching. I blinked away the tears in my eyes. I imagined my previous incarnations in the room with me, Rama and Krishna and all the rest, letting their own God energies shine on Rupa's sickness, easing it away. Aya was trying to signal something to me, but I couldn't tell what he wanted. Lakshman, my cousin, took my hand and squeezed it. He leaned over, pressed his shoulder into mine, and whispered, "I'll help," into my ear. I turned back to Rupa and put my thumb back on her forehead while Lakshman held my other hand. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Aya nod. I tried again, this time with Lakshman, pushing and pushing the God energy, spinning more of it from the cotton in my mind, and Rupa lay there, breath rasping inside her chest, not moving except for her eyes. She opened her mouth and the room was silent. She mouthed something. I leaned forward to hear, still too quiet. I pressed my ear against her lips. "You look constipated," she said. I didn't realize I had laughed until I heard the bark of it echo back at me from the silent room. Some of the villagers traded looks. Heat prickled up through my head and narrowed my vision. "It'll take time to heal her," Aya said, his voice booming across the room. "She needs to stay at the ashram until she's well." People nodded. The girl's mother and father looked at each other for a long time, searching for something, the mother's eyes baggy and raw. The father turned to me and bowed, acknowledging his consent. I clenched my hands into tight fists to keep them from trembling. "Meditation time," Aya said. Rupa's father picked her up and put her in his lap. Everyone bent their heads for meditation. Lakshman still held my hand, his little fingers slippery in mine. I lowered my face too, grateful that the angle hid my tears.
Incredible. I love that scene so much. And Lakshman is such an amazing character. It's not even on my list of questions, but when he comes into the scene, I feel, can you talk a little bit about his character?
Yeah, I wanted Lakshman to very much be a foil for Kalki. So Lakshman is around Kalki's age, a little bit younger. He's his cousin and his best friend, and the only one who really seems to see Kalki as a child. And so the interesting thing about Lakshman, and he is one of my favorite characters that I've ever written, I think, is that he is much more suited to being a child god than Kalki ever was. Right? Kalki is sort of nerdy and bookish and awkward and doesn't really know what to do at the right times, whereas Lakshman has natural charisma. He's funny. He is good looking. He just sort of tends to say the right things. He seems to know what people need to hear. And in a lot of ways, he would have been a better pick to be a child god, but Kalki's the one with blue skin. And Lakshman resents him for it, right? Like any 9-year-old would, Lakshman is at times, pitying Kalki for all the burden that he's carrying. And at other times, he is jealous and angry and, sort of spiteful because Kalki's getting all of the attention and he's perpetually in Kalki's shadow. So he's a very complicated character, even as a child.
And yet we never doubt that Lakshman cares deeply for Kalki. Like, they sleep in bed together, they hold each other. And Lakshman's the one, Lakshman also has wisdom in a way that I think Kalki at least doesn't have access to as a child. Lakshman's the one that drives, and I wanted to ask you about this too. There's a pretty significant reveal early on in the novel, which I think is really bold of you as a writer, because I know for myself at least, and probably for other writers, I'm guessing, we come up with this idea for a reveal and we want to hoard it. Like, we're going to make it wait and we drag it out. You give it it's a very generous move in that you give it to readers right around page 40 of what is it's a 300-page novel. Can you talk about just structuring it that way? And let me just say too, before anyone thinks, well, why is Sindu making this choice? The reveal, ironically or paradoxically, I don't know, actually deepens the mystery. So it was no question a brilliant move, but how did you come up with it?
It took a very long time. This was a late thing. The novel went through, like, every revision I did had a different structure. And that I had never done that with a novel before. I mean, this is only my second, I guess it's the third novel I have written. It's the second novel I published, but I had never really played around with structure this much. And I found myself in every draft changing the structure in some way, because, like, drastically, because I had this push and pull, right? In every novel, in every story, there is a driving question. There's a dramatic question that is the driving engine of the novel. And sometimes one question gets swapped out for another, or sometimes there's a set of questions, but there's usually one big question that we're reading to find out about. And so I wanted the question to be about what is the nature of faith and what happens when you lose faith. I wanted that to be like, this sort of highfalutin, sort of big concept question. But there was this push and pull, because the more obvious question is Kalki a god or isn't he? And that's the question that, like, industry professionals like agents were trying to push me toward, because it is a much more it's an easier question to put at the center of a novel, in that it has obvious stakes. It has stakes already built in, whereas the other question is sort of philosophical and, like, we don't really know what it means. So we don't really know, like, what the stakes are, right? Like, what is the stakes of losing your faith? Who knows? So every structure change in the novel was me trying to do both questions, or trying to prioritize one question over the other. And eventually, I still think, like, the obvious question of is Kalki a god or isn't he is at the center of the novel, but I wanted the philosophical question to take precedence, I guess. And so the reveal, which is basically, and, like, without giving anything away, we basically get a glimpse of Kalki's life when he's in his early 30s. And that gives us some answers that we were kind of already had questions for. And I sort of placed it there because I wanted the more philosophical question to become the driving force of the novel. Not, even though we don't actually get an answer for the is Kalki a god or isn't he? I think we get we get answers for enough questions that we start to wonder more about how did Kalki get from the ashram to where he is in his 30s. How did that journey happen? And so the novel becomes about that journey instead of like a gotcha question of like just one or the other.
Yeah, it felt to me as a reader like, okay, I do have this question almost from page one about, the nature of Kalki's godness. And then once you give us a glimpse to possibilities, because it's not resolved, we just get some more clues. It feels like doors continue to open, and that by the time you're in the final third of the novel or the fourth section, the last act, we absolutely do have that big question about faith and God and fraud and all of that that continues to be wrestled with, but the real like hooks of it kind of that draw us along initially. I think it has kinship to like mystery novels in a way. I don't know. I don't know. I thought it was really brilliant. I want to steal.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah.
It took a long time to come to, to figure out exactly how to do it.
And it's ultimately an act of generosity because it does feel hoarding to withhold like the good stuff from readers. It feels like a really generous, loving way to tell a story. Here's all the information. Now, actually, now you're giving readers a bigger mystery.
I think like, the readers like to be manipulated to a certain extent. Like they want to have that withheld from them just long enough. Mark Weingardner, one of our our major professor from PhD, used to say that the way you build suspense into a novel is to make somebody ask a question and then withhold the answer. And I think that's absolutely correct. But I think if the reader starts to think that they're being manipulated to an extent that's not kind, that they're being toyed with rather than just given a good experience. There's a line there, like, you want a good experience as a reader and suspense is part of it, but you don't want to be toyed with. And because it's sort of insulting. It's insulting to your intelligence as a reader. It's insulting, it feels like bad faith, right? So I didn't want to cross that line. So it's always really tricky, I think, in any novel to figure out exactly where that line exists.
Right. It makes me think too of like mystery little m, and then your novel's so much about faith, mystery capital M, and how they work in tandem. I want to make sure we have time for all these other questions that I have. There's a real performance aspect too. So along with God and fraud, there's also notions of performing in the ashram, and then in the last half of the final section of the novel, like literal performance on a stage, costumes. Can you talk about, was that part of your initial conception, or did that evolve organically as you started to see, so much of this is performance?
I think it came organically, but I'm not surprised that it came because, my scholarly interests are in queer theory, and performativity is a huge part of queer theory. Even though I wasn't specializing in queer theory specifically in my PhD, I had in my master's program, and one of the theories of Judith Butler that really strikes me and sticks with me is her theory of performativity, where she argues that identity creation is a set of performances that are repeated over and over. So we don't, have innate identities. We create them actively through performance. You are not a woman. You create identity for yourself as you perform it. And it's interesting. It definitely can be critiqued, and it has been. But I think that was really kind of driving me, and very much in my head as I thought about the novel. And as I started writing it, and as I realized that, of course, this life as a child god, there is no script for it. He is like many queer people working with a blank slate, and he is like many queer people, working against a society and against a set of expectations that are given to him, but there's no alternative script for him to follow. So he's just doing it all himself. He's just like trying to figure out who he is by performing certain things over and over. And so I thought that was a really good way to look at this novel and the writing of it. And I also argue that, it's not just Kalki performing to create his identity, it's me performing the voice of Kalki in order to create his identity. So it was like, I just find to approach the writing process from the perspective of queer theory to be really useful for me as a writer, just because I understand the writing process better when it's sort of contextualized in theoretical approaches that I love and understand. So that was definitely an intentional choice. Eventually, as it started to appear, I noticed it and then made it more of an intentional choice. And then, of course, like the last part of the novel, the last third, sort of, it is like an unraveling of everything that's so tight in the first 2/3. Everything that's so tightly sculpted sort of starts to unravel into a bigger questions, bigger world, bigger concerns for Kalki. And as that happens, the performance aspect starts to become more explicit.
It becomes very visible. And in this way, we always talk about how effective endings are often both surprising and inevitable because you built in the whole performance aspect, or because it evolved in the first 2/3. By the time we get to the end, it feels, of course it turned out this way, but I could have never predicted it going this way. So, and again, I mean, where it ends up is thrilling, but in no way does it feel like, well, where in the world did that come from? Of course it came from there, but we can't, just as we can't see where our own lives are headed, I think in the best stories, we can't see where our characters are headed, but when they get there, we're like, of course. That's not a question, that's just admiration. Once again, one of my notes here is, so writing for an audience that might not be familiar with Kalki's world. I saw you making moves that I really admired and that helped me as a reader, and yet I was also acutely aware that you had to make those moves. Mm-hmm. Do you know what I mean? If you, like, how did you make those decisions? Like, can you talk a little bit about that? As for me, who also writes about worlds where not every reader is going to be familiar with them, trying to negotiate that and compromising and resenting and needing to and wanting to too.
I think I was actually in Cherokee, North Carolina when I just had this insight. I was like struggling with the novel. My partner Jeff and I were going on a hike, and I was like, I need to figure this out. If I don't figure it out, if I don't break this wall, I can't finish this novel. And I mean, I can finish it as a dissertation. I can't make it into a book. And I had this flash of insight that's like, of course, adult Kalki is writing his memoir. And that clarified so much for me. So it's not me telling the story of young Kalki as he ages, it's adult Kalki writing his own story. And once I clarified that, then I'm like, okay, who is Kalki's audience? Who does he want to reach? Not who I want to reach. Who does he want to reach? And, how is he going to balance explaining versus immersion? So, whenever you're writing about these worlds, that's always the question, right? How much do you explain and how much do you just drop the reader into the world? And so when I was thinking about that question, it was easier to think through the eyes of Kalki. So of course, like me, Kalki is a, sort of knows like post-colonial perspectives on minor literature, and so I really think that he is the kind of person, especially as an adult, who wouldn't want to explain or define a lot of the Tamil words that he uses. So the Tamil words are just thrown in there. It's an immersion tactic. They're not italicized. They're not any different from the English words. They're just like dropped in, and we just sort of have to catch up. And I think in that sense, there's enough contextual stuff that you can understand it, and people have Google. But then there were also other things that people might be familiar with or might not. Like even for a South Asian audience, there were certain aspects that like of specific mythology, specific, quotes from say, religious texts that I didn't think the average South Asian would know, especially in the diaspora, especially if they're reading an English language novel. And so if they're not familiar, if like the average diaspora South Asian was not familiar with something or might not be, then I would explain it. That was my sort of litmus test. And then I also like struggled with how much not to explain the queer aspects of the novel. And I sort of erred on the side of not explaining much. I just sort of assumed that readers would know when I say this character is non-binary, they would know what that meant. And of course, there's Google, you can look it up. So there were a different set of concerns with the South Asian aspects and the queer aspects. And there's a different answer for each. But for me, the absolute sort of shining moment was figuring out that I needed to write it as Kalki's memoir. And once I did, then it was easy to see who Kalki would be speaking to.
Yeah, that's amazing. That's amazing. And you made me think of a question too in the middle that I have here, but I'm going to skip ahead and ask it now. So you talked about one of your interests in creating Kalki was we want to root for him, and absolutely we do root for him. At the same time, Kalki is a flawed character. Kalki doesn't always treat his best friend Lakshman well. Kalki also does not fully recognize, his privilege at times. And I'm guilty of this, absolutely. I think so many of us are. And yet, I think it's tempting for writers to write characters who, I don't know what I'm trying to say here, how to say it. I think we're tempted to write. We think that our readers, if we want to create a character that our readers will root for, we think we give them a lot of problems and all the problems will, but Kalki has so much going for him at times. And yet, like, how did you approach that? The Brahmin status, you talk, you help me out here. You know what I mean?
Yes. So Kalki is extremely privileged, right? He is, I think of him as non-binary, but he's cis-passing. He is he's bisexual, but when he's young, especially, he's straight passing, and people just assume that he's straight, and so does he. And then like he's Brahmin, which puts him, he's the part of the dominant caste or the oppressor caste. And he, everyone around him, he never meets a caste oppressed person until like he leaves the ashram, right? And so his world is so small. And I wanted him to be a privileged character that then has to contend with that privilege. And so I specifically, I did want him to contend with most of his privilege. And so like when I was thinking about Kalki as a character, I was like, okay, so he's here and he needs to be extremely privileged because of course, I mean, he's even child god, like everybody is sort of bowing down to him. And so he's here. And then I wanted to place around him enough characters that will challenge him. So the first one is Lakshman, who is like always like, you know, challenging him on the basis of being a child god. And then there's this character named Sita and his mother and Rupa and this girl named Kalyani who come to the ashram. And all of these women and girls challenge him on the basis of gender and his male privilege, and they're always like, through their eyes he sees how patriarchal his society is. And then, you know, once he leaves the ashram, there are other characters. There are queer characters, there's a Dalit character, there's non-binary characters who are sort of again feeding back into him his own bullshit in a lot of ways, like the ways in which he is not seeing the world as it really is, and that helps to change him and wakes him up to his own privilege. And it was also like I was also writing a character who was more privileged than me, which was really an interesting experience. So like a young boy, sure, but also, you know, I'm not Brahmin. I'm not, you know, I don't get to take advantage of patriarchy in that way. And so that was a really interesting experience to sort of imagine what that privilege would feel like.
Yeah. Which makes me think too, and I know we're starting to run out of time, but I have like a couple more questions I really want to ask. Can you talk a little bit about writing outside of that experience, the research you did? I know in your acknowledgments and thanks and sensitivity readers, can you talk about how we writers can be successful in doing that?
I have a very, like, I believe that we should all be writing diversity, but I don't think that we are all entitled to write anyone's story. I don't think that we get to take ownership of other people's story, but we also can't fill our worlds, our fictional worlds, with characters who are exactly like us. So there's a fine line there. And I draw the line at, you know, I want to create diverse characters, but I am not going to take on the voice of somebody who is minoritized in a way that I am not. So I don't want to appropriate that person's experience or presume to know what their life is like. At the same time, I want that character in my story. I just won't take the step of telling it from their perspective, which I think is the dangerous sort of line to cross. That's kind of what I've arrived at, because I want Black characters in my story. I want caste oppressed characters in my story. I want trans characters in my story. And you know, all three do appear in Blue Skinned Gods, and that's what I want. But I also don't want to, you know, presume to take on their voice. So that's kind of how I arrived at, you know, how I was going to do this. Is that my personal rule for myself is that if I'm going to write a character who is oppressed in a way that I am not, I'm going to do the research that I need to do it right. Whether that means like reading 15 books just to create a character who appears for 10 pages, fine. Like that's the work and it needs to be done. I'm also going to absolutely get sensitivity readers or authenticity readers to make sure I do it right. And I mean, my authenticity readers for Blue Skinned Gods were so important. They pointed out all the ways in which I was getting so much wrong, even though I'd done so much research. And it was I'm so grateful to them for guiding me through how to sensitively and sort of best practices for writing these characters. And at the same time, I think we like I don't feel weird about writing the voice or appropriating the voice of a character who's more privileged than me. So I don't feel weird about writing Kalki, or getting inside his skin or walking around in his world as him. Because he is way more privileged than me in so many ways, and that's fine to me. So I don't feel bad about writing white characters, for example, or rich characters, or people who are much more privileged. So that's my personal rule for myself, is that I am allowed to take on the voice of anyone who is more privileged than me, but I am not allowed to do it the other way around. And if I'm gonna write those characters, I have to do the work. So it was really interesting. I mean, even to write Kalki, I wanted to get the details of being a Brahmin, being a Vaishnavite Brahmin, in that specific environment. I wanted it correct, and a Tamil Vaishnava Brahmin specifically. And so I did get an authenticity reader for that specifically, who guided me on all of the things I was doing wrong, which I was doing a lot wrong. So it was a really it was a wonderful, really eye-opening experience to have all these readers helping me.
Amazing. Quickly, 2 questions. I haven't asked you about this before, but I know Lucky, is this the Lucky from Marriage of a Thousand Lies that shows up in Blue Skin Gods?
Yes, it is Lucky. I noticed that in the time that, between Marriage of a Thousand Lies coming out, and, while I was writing Blue Skin Gods, a lot of the people who were like tagging me in posts or reviews or things like that, or even at in-person events, which we used to have, people would ask, like, what happens to Lucky? Because like her story sort of ends on a hopeful note, but it doesn't give you the answer, right? It's the entire novel takes place in the space of 4 months, so it's a very tightly constructed novel. It's a tight frame, so we don't get to see what Lucky looks like later. So I wanted to answer that question without like writing a sequel or writing a short story of Lucky later on. And my way was to bring her into Blue Skin Gods. So she does appear in, I don't know, the last 50 pages of the novel or so. And you get to see her and what her life looks like 3-4 years after Marriage of a Thousand Lies.
It felt like such a joy and a surprise again to encounter Lucky, and also Jeff Bouvier's byline felt like this delicious little secret for readers. Can you answer 2 more questions? Do we have time for 2 questions?
Yes.
'Cause I want to talk.
Yes.
The other thing that about your book is that I think is so interesting. One of the ways that Kalki begins to educate himself is he starts to read. He's given books and encouraged to read books, and then that he has to hide from his father. So in your book, books are educate, open up worlds, and are also dangerous. And you talk about writing this book in this era, how now we're seeing an escalation of books that are considered dangerous, and books are being banned. And we know that books by writers of color and books by queer writers are often the ones that are banned. Can you talk about how we writers write dangerous truths in our book, or dangerous fiction, or how do we approach being honest in our work, knowing that some people consider what we're writing dangerous?
I think I was always aware that some people considered books dangerous, and certain books especially. And on the flip side of that is that books are powerful. If they're dangerous, they are also extremely powerful, and the uh, they have the power to change people or change the world even. And in Sri Lanka, uh, there's a scary tradition of writers being disappeared. And I knew that certain books were banned by the government, and that we weren't allowed to have them. So even as a young child, I was like, 5, 6, 7, I knew that there were certain books I wasn't allowed to have, and that people had disappeared, writers had disappeared because they had written them, or had been exiled and were living in exile out of the island. And so I was aware of that as a child. And then I came here to the US, to North America. And, once I came out as queer, I also saw that, so many queer books were banned, by not just by school boards, but by libraries, sometimes by entire communities where children just weren't allowed to read these books. And then when I, in my very first teaching experience, I taught the novel, or the graphic memoir Fun Home by Alison Bechtel. This was in 2010 or something, 11 maybe. And I got in trouble because one of my students, their family lawyer called up the dean and threatened to sue the school because I was teaching obscene material. And keep in mind, this is a graphic memoir that was a New York Times bestseller, eventually became a musical on Broadway. So the only obscene material was that there was brief nudity, and there was a lot of queerness, and there were like lesbian sex scenes in it, and like it was definitely for adults, but it was still extremely uncomfortable for people. And then one of my friends from my master's program, Emily Danforth, her novel, the Miseducation of Cameron Post, which eventually also became a movie, was banned in certain school districts. And it was a YA novel about a young lesbian teenager, and in going through conversion therapy. And that book was banned, and then there was this whole scandal around it. And so I was very much aware of the danger and the dangerous power of books, all through my childhood and adult life. So I knew that for Kalki, I wanted him to be able to access the outer world from his tiny bed at the ashram, where he's super isolated. And the only way to really do that was through books. It's the way my world expanded as a child and as a teenager and as an adult. And it's how, and I think that's one of my favorite things about reading, is to be able to access a world that I wouldn't normally be able to access. Your novel, for example, Bewilderness, everybody should read it. It's fantastic. But you brought me into a world in your novel that I was only vaguely aware existed, and like had never really encountered. But you just sort of drop us in, and we are we're sort of astounded, or I was astounded by how rich and beautiful and heartbreaking this world was, but something I would never have known how to experience without your book. And so I think that's just part of writing, but one of the best parts of writing.
You're so generous and kind. Thank you for saying that. Okay, so last question, and this is the perfect segue. You're working on 2 graphic novels. Is that what's coming next? And
yes,
a literary novel.
Yes.
You have 3 projects. Can you talk about them?
Yes. Yes. So I have a graphic novel called Shakti, It is coming out in the summer of 2023, and it is being illustrated by the extremely talented Nabi H. Ali. And so that's done. It's Nabi's illustrating right now, and so we're going back and forth on the actual renderings of the book. And it's a fantasy middle grade novel with queer content. And my second graphic novel is coming out in 2024. I just finished the draft and sent it off to you, Karen, and to the rest of my writing group. And I am excited about it. It's called Tall Water, and it is a YA novel about the 2004 tsunami that hit Sri Lanka and other places in the area. And then I'm working on a literary novel called War Child. I'm also working on two other projects that are like, I don't know why I work on all these projects at the same time, but I do. And it's nice to be working again. The pandemic was difficult for most people. But for a lot of writers, that what I've heard from most people is that I haven't been able to write. And I'm like, yes, that's absolutely true. I haven't been able to write in the pandemic, and I finally am starting to finish things again, and it feels great.
Amazing. Amazing. You're incredible.
You're
Is there
incredible.
anything else that we should talk about? I know we're about out of time, but what do you think?
No, I thank you for your questions, and thank you for reading the work so carefully and generously, and especially thanks for reading it early in its stages. And that's the one thing I would say, if to any aspiring writer, is to surround yourself with people who are good readers for you. And I was lucky to find Karen and a group of others and we've been, I don't know, how long has the writing group been going? Years now.
Yeah.
3 years, 4 years, something like that.
Mm-hmm.
And it's fantastic to have people who can help you at that stage of writing. So that would be my biggest recommendation if you want to be a writer, is to find a group for yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Sindu.
Yeah, thank you.